The Devil Shaman Curse. Brandon Erickson stumbled into the bar, wearing a face of drunken sadness. Yes, he had been drinking even before he arrived at the bar. He'd woken up at 12 and drank until 4. Then at 9 o'clock p.m. he had decided to drive under the influence from his work at the gas station, his coveralls still stinking of the sour fume of gasoline. He only had one destination in mind, the Creek Bar, where he hoped to meet a friend of his. After that, who knew? There was never any way to tell. "Usual," Brandon said, parking himself at a stool by the bar. "Coming up," the bartender replied. Brandon slicked back his knotted hair. He burped delightfully and smiled. He looked awful on that Friday night, more so than his usual nightly benders. While sober, he was a manager at the local gas station. Brandon was nothing special, but he got the job done, and never complained. Behind the bar, he did nothing but complain, and his mind was churning with new topic starters. "Long day?" the bartender asked, leaning forward with a fresh drink. Brandon took the frosty glass, nodding his head as if it was on a spring instead of a neck. "Let's hope for an even longer weekend," he replied. While the bartender laughed, Brandon threw back his chin, gargling a mouthful of beer. "You haven't seen Phoebe?" Brandon asked. The man only shook his head. "You two been fighting again?" Brandon rubbed his eyes with his fist. "You don't even want to know about it. She's going on about her career as a painter again. All I want is for her to be realistic. We got bills to pay, and she accuses me of being unproductive." "Me?" The bartender shook his head empathetically. "Well, in that case, we should be seeing her soon then. But please tell me you won't make a scene like before." "Who, me?" Brandon asked, with a drunken smile. On cue, the bar door opened and a beautiful young woman entered. Brandon had to squint his bloodshot eyes to put her in perspective, although he already knew it was her. She sat down at the opposite end of the bar without looking at Brandon and called for the bartender. Brandon felt like screaming, especially since she had taken the stool next to the nearest guy with a beard and leather jacket. A lot of bikers frequented the Creek Bar on their way out of town. Brandon had never seen her wear such bright lipstick, but that was her color of choice for the occasion. She had also changed her look since he'd last seen her the night before. Usually after one of their fights, Phoebe stormed off to stay with her girlfriend on the other end of town, and he didn't see her for the next couple of days. Yet she frequented the Creek Bar just as often as he did, and they were always likely to run into each other there. Brandon knew it was a game she liked to play. She would flirt with the barflies, while he simmered to a level far surpassing anger. Then he would attack the barfly in a drunken rage and get his ass thrown outside in the dirt. Afterward, Phoebe would scrape him off the ground and lead him home again, where they would initiate the carnal ritual of make-up sex. He'd practice the same thing time and time again. In substitution of her usual short skirts and halter tops, she now wore a black long overcoat and high stockings. She still had her same hair length, which was smartly pulled back into a ponytail. Even though this new look didn't suit Brandon, he knew she was only trying to infuriate him by pretending to be someone else. She couldn't be held responsible for anything she did when she was like this, simply because she wasn't herself. But there was something in her eyes that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else, eyes full of innocence and reminiscence. Brandon watched as the biker leaned toward Phoebe with a new interest. Phoebe watched him intently, red lips parting. "I'd like to buy that woman a drink," Brandon said, signaling for the barman. "That's okay, I can get my own drinks," Phoebe replied without looking at Brandon. She scooted her bar stool closer to the stranger, who asked her if he could buy her a drink. "Of course you can," she said. Soon afterward, the barman set a glass of beer down in front of Phoebe, who of course knew what she liked. Brandon pulled his own drink close and gritted his teeth. "Bottoms up," Brandon remarked, polishing off his glass. Phoebe did the same at her end. Suddenly, Brandon stood up and sat down on the other side of the biker. Phoebe watched him do this, her glass poised between her fingertips. The man turned to look at Brandon, measuring him up and down, before turning back to Phoebe. Brandon tapped the bar and gave his order to the tender. He unzipped his coat and waited for his glass of beer. All the while, he watched the man through his peripherals. Brandon gulped heavily from the next mug, and once he was sure he was loose enough, he started to speak. "I'm Brandon," he said, offering his hand across the bar. The man stared at the hand for a long time before finally taking it. "John," he said. The name lit up in Brandon's head, burning as neon. "So, you live in town?" Brandon asked. "Here and there," he growled over his shoulder. "Oh yeah? I know the area well. I've been here and there myself." Hey, fuck off, John snapped. He gave Brandon a hard look before emptying his shot glass. Phoebe laughed behind her hand. In Brandon's mind, he was tearing into John's face with his nails, but on the outside, he was grinning and nodding. I just wanted to meet you, Brandon pressed. I admire you. John obviously didn't know what to do with this because he shook his head from side to side. There was a quiet cautiousness about him now. You admire me? He scoffed. Yeah, you're just such a piece of shit. I had to know your name so we wouldn't be strangers, Brandon replied with a smile. We can be friends, you and I. John was off the stool now, hovering over Brandon with his fists clenched. Brandon only glared back up at him, wearing the same false smile. What did you call me? John cried. I don't know. You don't know? Brandon sighed and turned back around in his stool. He noticed that the bartender was staring at them both, and he signaled that he was ready to pay. Hey man, what the fuck is your problem? John spat. Brandon was about to say something else when Phoebe touched John's arm to get his attention. Forget him, Phoebe said. Why don't we sit somewhere more private? John immediately loosened. At first, he refused to turn his back on Brandon, but once the girl said his name again, he was pulling her tight. With their drinks, they navigated away from the bar and into the empty dining area. He ushered Phoebe into the booth and nestled in close to her. With a red face, Brandon marched away to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. In Brandon's absence, a large man settled in at the bar, with his sleeves rolled up and his long white hair pulled back into a ponytail. He pushed away Brandon's half-finished beer before waving the bartender closer. He looked to be Mexican with brown hair, his face heavily wrinkled and worn. You're passing through? The bartender asked him. Yes, my daughter lives close, the man replied with a tired smile. She told me to meet her here. I'm on a trip and might not see her for a while. How do you like Twin Creek? I think it's a lovely little town. The large man puckered his mouth with his eager swallow of beer. My daughter seems to enjoy the quiet. He heard something from within the bathroom, and he turned that way. Someone was humming loudly, but not in song. This was a fierce hum, like something a tired mother would do to drown out the cries of her baby. The bartender heard it too, and they both exchanged a look. Is that guy okay? The man asked. There was a crash, and the door rebounded off the wall. Brandon emerged with his face and hair soaking. His eyes were focused directly on John and Phoebe. He swayed slowly across the floor, blowing past the bar and his drink. Brandon, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave, the bartender said, but when Brandon did not answer, he hopped over the bar and began his pursuit. I want you to pay your tab and leave, okay? John saw Brandon and stood up at once, pausing to lay a hand on Phoebe's shoulder. She was watching them with wide eyes, open with anticipation. John, Brandon said, only feet from the table, I just want to shake your hand. He held out his hand, still damp from the bathroom sink. What do you want? John asked, squeezing the girl's shoulder. The bartender grabbed Brandon's arm, pulling him away from the booth. Brandon made eye contact with Phoebe and his features dropped. He tried to smile, but he couldn't raise a single muscle in his cheeks. He stared at her stupidly, completely oblivious to the man on his back. Let's go, the bartender scowled. This man is afraid of me, Brandon said to his girlfriend, pointing a finger at John. He knows who I am. John was laughing. Yeah, I'm afraid of you. Right. This man is obviously drunk. He needs to be taken outside. I haven't even finished my second beer, you fuck, Brandon screamed. The bartender had Brandon by the collar and struggled to haul him backward. Brandon tried his best to shake away from his hands and even elbowed the man once in the chin. Phoebe cried out as Brandon sprang at the table. John recoiled back against the wall, his hands out to protect his face. The large Mexican tackled Brandon to the ground and upset the table in the process. Glass sprayed across the floor and cool beer pooled under Brandon's body. The man struck Brandon once across the cheek and would have stopped there, but Brandon spat blood on his coat, so he had to bloody his nose. Brandon started to scream, thrashing his limbs wildly and digging his scalp into the crystals of glass. The bartender and the man both hooked their hands under each of Brandon's arms and lugged him toward the exit. They dragged him outside and dropped him off on the ground. His head rebounded off the hard gravel and he went silent fast. He closed his eyes and grunted heavily. You need some fucking help, the bartender yelled. He kicked gravel in Brandon's face and then stormed back into the bar. The large man stayed behind and watched Brandon for a long moment before bending down to look into his bloody face. What were you thinking? The man asked. You need to pick your battles. Brandon managed to open his eyes into slits, but his world was only a blurry mess. I'm sorry I hit you, but you were asking for it. Brandon groaned. Through the dark blur, a figure was starting to emerge. The man straightened himself and lightly brushed at the blood on his front. He inhaled deeply and looked up into the night sky. "There's something in the wind," he said. His features were coming in through the grain, ever so gradually. There was a nose and a chin. He had long white hair, almost Native American in nature. "Beyond the smells, it's in the air. I feel it coming." Then the large man was gone, receding into the night. Brandon blinked tears out of his eyes and then closed them. Footsteps crunched in the gravel and he heard female laughter as Phoebe joined him in the parking lot. She bent down over him, holding her sides as she laughed. "Good show," she said. "You sure know how to entertain a woman." "You're fucking sick," Brandon said through a mouthful of blood. Still, he couldn't help but smile. He was just that drunk. "Come on," Phoebe said, holding out her hands. She strained to help him to his feet and she dusted off the back of his clothes. "Let's go home, tough guy." "Your car or mine?" Brandon said through the nauseous cloud. He knew what Phoebe meant by go home. Their fights always ended the same way. Only this time Brandon might have a broken nose. "Yours," Phoebe replied. "I got a ride here from a friend." "A friend? What friend?" Phoebe simply smiled and led him toward his car. He shook out his keys as if to drive, but she took them from his hand. Even though she had been drinking too, she was sure that her motor skills were much sharper than his. He was practically falling asleep on his feet. She tucked him into the passenger seat where he instantly nodded off. Then she got behind the wheel and reversed, tearing out of the parking lot in a spray of dust. She slammed the stick into drive and accelerated forward, straight at a stop sign. Her hands tore the steering wheel to a harsh left, away from the sign, and with a horrible scream, the car struck a woman in the parking lot. She flipped over the hood, striking the windshield in a spiderweb crack. Then she jettisoned forward when Phoebe braked hard. The woman collected in a ball on the ground, lifeless. Phoebe was breathing hard, about ready to tear the steering wheel away from its mechanism. Brandon was still asleep in the front seat, hanging awkwardly in the cradle of his seatbelt. The silence that followed was so intense that her only thought was to break it. She sped away, the screeching of her tires ripping through the night. Back at their apartment building, Phoebe sat in the car for a long few minutes, running the accident through her head. She was unsure if it had really happened or not, but one look at the crack in the windshield had her crying uncontrollably into her hands. Brandon shook awake in the passenger seat. "What's wrong?" he asked. He had just realized where they were, parked in front of their home. Then he saw the crack in the windshield and had to do a double take. "What happened?" She began. "You crashed the car?" he cried suddenly, sitting up in his seat. He sounded completely sober for the first time that day. "What'd you hit?" "A woman," Phoebe sobbed. "Jesus Christ, is she all right?" Phoebe blinked back at him through a screen of tears. Her red lips twitched with the beginnings of bad news. "I don't know." "You don't know? You fucking left her there?" "I didn't know what to do," she argued. Her tone pleaded for Brandon to understand. "It happened so fast. I shouldn't be driving anyway if you hadn't drank so much." "We need to go back." Brandon shook his head violently, as if he thought that would wake him up from his nightmare. He stumbled out of his seat to look at the damage to the front of his car. A long string of curses followed. Phoebe got out to approach him. "We can't go back. She's probably in the hospital already." "Then that's where we're going," he mumbled. He held out his hands for the keys. She held them tight. "There's nothing we can do there. Why would we go?" "I don't know. Just give me the fucking keys." At this last outburst, she surrendered the keys and they quickly switched seats. With a focused conviction Phoebe had never seen before, Brandon drove the car out of the complex and into the main street. They turned off on Medical Avenue, winding up the hill toward the only hospital in Twin Creek. They parked near the ER and hurried through the automatic doors. They squinted in the bright fluorescent lighting. Judging by the streaks of blood down Brandon's front, the others might have assumed he was there to be seen. Brandon approached the front counter and the woman eyed him carefully, ready to ask him for his name. "Was there a woman who came in here?" Brandon stammered. "She was in a car accident." "I'm sorry, I don't have any information for you," the woman replied. "If you have her name, I can get back to you. If you'd sit down." "I don't have her name." "Well, I don't know. She was dark-skinned," Phoebe said. "She looked Spanish or—" The double doors leading into the emergency room opened and a large man stepped out, moaning under his breath. Brandon immediately recognized him as the man who had bloodied his nose at the bar. His white hair was bright in the fluorescence like a clean mirror. The large man recognized Brandon as well. He stopped, blinking tears out of his eyes. "You," the man snapped. "I saw you speed away. You hit my daughter." "No!" Brandon looked around at all the faces in the lobby, now focused on him. "That wasn't us. We went after the guy who did this. That's why we came here, to see if she's..." "She's dying," the man roared. "And if she dies, I will see you pay. I will see this entire town answer for her death." The woman behind the counter cleared her throat. Sir, I have to ask you, under the order of the Yaqui Devil Shaman of Mexico, I promise you hell on earth. The man's eyes widened and glinted with a hidden spark that quickly caught fire. He pointed a finger at Brandon's chest. And the dead will walk and set fire to their own town. The spirits will follow you home tonight as a reminder of my promise. Phoebe tugged on Brandon's sleeve, gravitating toward the exit. Brandon relented a few steps. He stared into the Mexican man's eyes, which hadn't stopped burning, and whose finger hadn't stopped pointing. And you both will die last, he finished, lowering his arm. He started to breathe hard, catching himself against the counter. Someone screamed and rushed to catch him as he almost fainted. As a group of concerned citizens crowded around him, Phoebe and Brandon took their opportunity to sprint outside, making a beeline for the car. Back in their apartment, Brandon sat down heavy and silent in an overstuffed chair. Phoebe paced the room, still dressed in her coat and her makeup running into a colorless shade across her face like a shroud. I bet she lives, Brandon assured her, although this did not stop her pacing. You weren't driving that fast, only out of the parking lot. You didn't see her on the ground, Phoebe replied. She didn't even move. Damn it, Phoebe, why? Brandon's statement was cut short by a terrible clatter in the kitchen. They both ran into the little nook, expecting to see that something breakable had fallen off its perch. With that respect, they were correct. Every drawer and cabinet was wrenched open with all its contents spilled across the floor. The destruction remained on the kitchen linoleum in the form of glass fragments and broken pieces of pottery. They exchanged perplexed looks. Phoebe backed away slowly out of the kitchen and turned on the television, switching feverishly through the channels for a news report about their hit and run. Amazingly, they didn't find anything on the news, either to confirm or invalidate the death of the poor woman. They spent most of their night in front of the TV, waiting like strained muscles for the bad news, but it never came. Under a silent, unspoken fear, they did not return to the kitchen or attempt to clean up. A few times in the night, under the glow of the television set, they heard footsteps behind them on the floor, but they would always turn to find nothing. Sometime later, they both fell asleep on the couch, coming in and out of agitated dreams of fire and strangers in their apartment. There was an unmistakable feeling of being watched, and Brandon thought he saw a figure standing outside on their terrace, just beyond the sliding glass door. The figure was smiling with a mouth full of sharp teeth, eyes burning like two flames, before it disappeared in a blink of his eye. Strangely, Brandon thought the figure looked a lot like him, especially with the black work uniform. He fainted down into a dark pit of unconsciousness. In the early morning, he wrestled out of his sleep with a surprisingly clear head. It was still dark outside, with an abundance of dark clouds on the horizon. Phoebe was still fast asleep in front of the running television, which had long ago switched over to a string of infomercials. Standing up, he decided he would rush back to the hospital before the sun came up to check on the woman. All he wanted was to see her face and see that she was still alive. There was nothing more he could think about. He didn't bother to change before he scrambled to the door, reaching for his keys on the kitchen table. They were right where he'd tossed them, but nothing else was right. Phoebe's vase was situated upside down, all the water pooling on the floor, and the flowers were washed up on the carpet like shriveled fish. He also noticed that all of the paintings in the house, the portraits Phoebe had painted herself, were hanging upside down like crooked windows. Brandon quickly thought twice about the keys before rushing out the door in a panic. It wouldn't be wise to arrive at the hospital anyway with a wrecked car. He would take the bus instead. With his heart lodged in his throat, Brandon prayed that it wasn't too late. At 3 a.m, Brandon settled in at the back of the bus, watching out the window as the town passed him by in a whirl. It was a cold night, he could tell from out of the frosty window. The vehicle came to a stop, and Brandon looked around confusedly. There was no one else on the bus but him. Not many people rode the bus so early, but on the other hand, there weren't many people in Twin Creek to begin with. There never were. The person who stepped onto the bus didn't look right to Brandon. He had disheveled hair and was limping on a mangled stump of a leg. It was bloody and was missing a pant leg. He had globe-like eyes that seemed to revolve around inside his head. He had a stupid, drunken look to his face, lips clenching and unclenching as if he was nervous. The female bus driver recoiled away from him as if slapped. "Sir, you're—" The man grabbed at her chestnut hair with a gnarled fist. He yanked her forward into her steering wheel and she gave out a horrid cry. He broke into a grin, and Brandon could see sharp teeth like a lion's. When he opened his mouth, a good amount of standing blood seeped out over his ruffled ski jacket. He reached with his other hand, and Brandon saw that he was missing all his fingers but one. The man grabbed her around the chin and squeezed. Her cries were muffled as a series of cracks and pops lit up her lower face. Pieces of bone poked from her chin and she became bug-eyed, blood dripping off her nostrils from when she connected with the steering wheel. Brandon sprang up from his seat, his thighs smacking across the seat's padding. The creature didn't notice Brandon at all. He continued to slam the woman's face into the windshield and bent over, fangs dangling. Then Brandon screamed, quickly covering his mouth with his hands. The man turned toward the sound, the woman crying through her dead mouth. His eyes stopped, Brandon dead in his tracks. His eyes were a deep gray, reflecting not even a sliver of light. Brandon tried to scream, but felt his lips being sewn shut. The man in the ski jacket started to approach Brandon, tongue hanging out of his head. The man tossed the bus driver aside, where she fell into the stairwell. She came halfway out of the bus before another man stepped inside, pulling her with him. This man looked like a skinhead. He had an orange bandana across his head, stained red, and green sunglasses over his eyes. But Brandon knew they were gray behind those shades, just like the man in the ski jacket. He threw the woman over the first seat, where she fell into the hard padding, wedging herself between the seat and the floor. Still, she screamed through her locked jaws. The skinhead looked at Brandon, and then at the man in the ski jacket. He sat down in the open driver's seat, adjusting the seat like he had driven a bus a million times, and tilting the rear view mirror to the correct angle. The man in the ski jacket advanced on Brandon with a quickened pace. He grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him towards his rotting mouth. The tongue sucked back into his face like a vacuum, his eyes rotating again like spinning gray globes. "Are you Brandon Erickson?" the man asked through a mouthful of blood. His teeth were stained yellow from the blood, but the fangs at the top of his mouth were spotless. "The Brandon that works at the gas station." Without a thought, Brandon nodded his head. The pressure in his head was tight as he felt the man's arms wrap around his back. "We must go there now," Brandon heard inside his head. "You must take us there now." "Why?" he asked back. It would seem that conversing with the stranger inside his head was perfectly natural. It was as if he had done it thousands of times before. Stranger still, Brandon felt himself begin to relax. That is best way to make sure no one gets out. No one gets out of here," the man hissed. "Out of where?" "Twin Creek," the man explained. "No one gets out of Twin Creek." Then the man's eyes burned like an out-of-control wildfire. Brandon's head felt like a plump pincushion, but that was okay. That felt just fine because the eyes seemed to tell him that everything was going to be just fine. They told him that Twin Creek was going under some slight renovation, but it was all for the best. Everything was going to be perfect. "I need to get to the hospital," Brandon thought. The man grinned as he bent over Brandon. "We can manage that," he seemed to say. "This is a bus, you know." The skinhead seemed to hear this because he smiled too, wrenching the bus into drive. He closed the door with one yank of a lever. He hit the gas and the bus was rolling again, and the man behind the wheel knew precisely where to go. They took off through cluttered roads where dead cars and bodies littered the pavement and sidewalks. "You know," the man said to him, "you have to look the part if you're going to the hospital." The ski jacket man opened his mouth and bit down on Brandon's nose. Without a scream of pain, the man wrenched backward with Brandon's nose in his mouth. He chewed on it like a piece of candy. Brandon remained sprawled across the back seat with his limp body tucked under him. Blood seeped down from the red crater in his face into large pools on the floor. He even wore a smile. The hospital was swimming with people. The main road was so jammed with cars that the bus had to physically ram a few blockades and a horrible crunch of metal. Everyone had seen what was happening in downtown Twin Creek. It was some kind of plague or sickness, causing the people to lose their minds and react violently. So far, no one had gotten out of Twin Creek due to the pileup of cars on the main road. Some people got out of their cars to push or roll the blockades out of the way, but there were beasts lurking in every alleyway, and no one was safe. The city bus parked at the curb in front of the ER, where people were being restrained into gurneys, and where nurses and doctors tried to keep the crowds ordered. Somewhere a gun fired, and the crowd jumped. Brandon stumbled out of the bus with a bright pain in his face, like a steel cattle prod easing into his flesh. He shook out of his daze, unsure as to where he was or how much time had passed. With a drunken determination, he cut through the hysterical people to get to the front of the building, toward the automatic doors. A nurse at the entrance tried to direct the oncoming flow of people, and she noticed Brandon's gruesome appearance. She motioned for another paramedic to take him. Brandon pushed the paramedic away with amazing strength and filed inside the ER, holding his face. He was faintly aware of the blood pouring through his fingers. Inside the chaos of the lobby, patients were being either treated or restrained. A male nurse rushed past Brandon, screaming that he was bit. Blood pumped from his neck, and his arm was cut off by the elbow. 2 doctors ran after him and tackled him to the ground. Brandon could faintly hear the far-off scream of the nurse, and then the doctors screamed. He heard the blare of a siren, and then dozens of people were storming down the clogged hallways, pushing past the wall-to-wall gurneys and screaming people. Brandon ducked into the waiting area, where people were taking refuge. Some were passed out on the uncomfortable seats. Men and women alike were elbow to elbow, butt to butt. Children had their faces plastered to the windows, looking down upon the city, dying beneath them. Brandon could see faint streaks of smoke drifting off from select neighborhoods, where house fires were surely raging. He could see the glint and sparkle of the ocean of cars, waiting to exit the town. Brandon proceeded through the doors into the emergency room. Delirious from the onslaught of people, Brandon swept on, unnoticed. He could remember why he was there. The shaman's daughter. He had to find her and make this right. He rounded the last corner, only to stumble upon a pile of dead people. They were leaning against the walls in bloody streaks and sticking half in and out of the open elevator doors. They were all civilians. A man wielding a shotgun leaned against the opposite wall, hands dripping with blood. He was wearing a nurse's uniform, and his scrubs were drenched red. There was a man stirring to the left, but he went unnoticed. "Oh God!" Brandon screamed, pushing past the mounds of dead corpses. The nurse turned toward him, the gun pointed at his chest. He suddenly looked ashamed. "I just wanted to get past them," the nurse murmured. "I tried to make them relax, but—" Brandon glanced again at the bodies spilled across the floor. There were innards and blood painted on the walls, and gaping holes shot into the plaster and elevator doors. The nearest wall-length window was shattered, allowing the wind to blow at the nurse's loose clothing and at Brandon's wet hair. "Here," the nurse said, tossing the shotgun to Brandon's feet. "I don't need it anymore. I don't need any of this anymore." The nurse turned to the window and looked out, his back to Brandon. "No!" Brandon darted forward, kicking at a bleeding torso at his heel. "If you're smart, you'll get out of this too, before those bastards get you," he said. He then leaned all his weight forward. He toppled out the 5th-floor window to collide with the crowd of people and cars below. There was a series of screams and shouts from below, but Brandon went away from the window. He wiped the blood from his face, picking up the shotgun thoughtfully. Right as he did that, 5 men broke through another set of double doors, all covered in blood. One was a little girl, and she clutched at a black teddy bear, still smoking as if burned. She hissed at Brandon, with her black hole for a mouth, blood spinning out in red driplets. They all advanced on him, stepping lightly over the corpses that decorated the floor. Brandon didn't look into their eyes. He raised the shotgun and fired until it was dead in his hands. The creatures collapsed in a heap. Brandon was able to peg 4 of them directly in the chests, blowing the rib cages wide open. The little girl was the only one left, though Brandon had already severed one side of her pelvis from her body. She hobbled at him, still hissing, teddy bear swinging from her side. Brandon hesitated, but found the strength to fight. He gathered his breath and threw his spent weapon at her. She fell on her back with a horrible crunch. He kicked open the double doors behind him and pushed through the delirious crowd. At the end of the hall, he heard another belching cry, and people streamed past him, away from the end of the wing. Yet Brandon pressed on. He thought he probably wouldn't make it, but he knew he had to try. He reached the end of the hall and heard the animal screams, but it didn't matter anymore. Everyone in that town was dead, and he could be sure that she was too. At the end of the hall, the large Mexican from the bar stepped out of one of the rooms to stand directly in front of Brandon. He no longer looked aged. His face was smooth, as if cut from stone, eyes glowing orange. His hair swung in a wild fan across his shoulders. Right before Brandon's eyes, he seemed to grow in height. For the second time that morning, Brandon became mesmerized in the man's eyes, and his muscles went loose. The man pointed a crooked finger inside the open room. Brandon saw a woman lying there in a hospital bed, peaceful yet unmoving. Her chest did not rise or fall. The machinery beside her bed remained cold and unresponsive. "I promise you die last," the man said, "and you will. Now, get back to the bus. You have a show to finish, gas man." Brandon nodded his head slowly and turned around on his heels, cutting through the carnage like Moses through the waters. Later that morning, the bus arrived at the gas station, swinging into a parking lot. The doors opened and the passengers shuffled out, grinning, mouths full of red teeth. Brandon and the man in the ski jacket were the last to step out. The man pointed his finger at Twin Creek's main road, just a mile from the station and down the hill. Brandon could see the cars weren't going anywhere, and that people had further clogged the road, struggling to claw their way out. "If this blows, they all go with it," the ski jacket man said inside Brandon's head. "No one gets out," Brandon agreed, with a slow nod. The ski jacket man nodded with his mouth wide open. "What am I to do?" Brandon asked. "The keys. Get the keys and point us to the trucks." "The trucks?" "The trucks that carry the ship gasoline," Ski Jacket Man replied. "Get the keys for the tanks under us. Everything goes." The man lifted his gangly arms in the simulation of an explosion. Brandon proceeded into the abandoned gas station and came back with a ring of keys. With a broken smile, Brandon selected one of the keys from the ring. It was always the largest key on the ring. The Ski Jacket Man turned toward Brandon. His eyes were sparkling orange. Brandon nodded and held the key up for them both to see. "The trucks," the Ski Jacket Man barked. "Where are the trucks?" "Out back, behind the locked fence. There's only one," Brandon announced. The man nodded and swept his arm at the panel at their feet. There was a single panel in the ground with a direct link to the main tank, which was filled every day or so by a large diesel truck. "Take this pistol. Finish it," the man commanded, tossing a gun at Brandon's chest. Then the Ski Jacket Man led his army toward the locked fence, where they would find the oil truck. Brandon noticed that most of them carried pistols. That was how they were going to set off the truck. He knew what to do with his own weapon. "No one leaves," Brandon muttered, with a voice that was no longer his own. Behind him, the creatures had peeled open the locked fence and were climbing in. They hissed delightfully, guns held at arm's length. Brandon found the main panel, camouflaged with the cold concrete. He found the keyhole at the edge of the panel. He pressed the key in and unlocked it, wrenching the plate open. He peered down at the nozzle, soldered into the top of the tank. He knew there was immense pressure inside the tank, and once he took off the double-plated nozzle, there would be a fountain of cool, flammable liquid. Standing erect, he cocked and aimed his pistol at the tank under his feet. On the road, he could hear the beep, car horns, and the screeching of tires. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Brandon fired into the darkness, and the nozzle rocketed into the sky with immense pressure. He fell back just in time to watch the gasoline pour out in a massive jet of liquid. It didn't take long for it to catch fire, reducing the fountain to an erupting volcano. The molten flames curled around his boots, causing them to melt and catch fire. There were 5 more gunshots, and then there was silence. The tank exploded underneath Brandon's feet, and he was thrown into the air, long tails of fire curling around him. The truck blew up a second later. The Ski Jacket Man disintegrated beneath his flaking coat. The rest of the monsters were torn apart in the enormous explosion, the fragments of twisted steel pinwheeling through the air, already clogged with soot. A steel piece of the tank burst upward out of the ground in a jolt of crumbling asphalt and fire. The remains of the truck spiraled into the air in a line of ash and smoke. A mushroom fireball burst into the sky like a blooming flower. That quickly faded to reveal a gaping skull of black smoke. Twin Creek's main road was torn apart. The cars were rocked off the street with the helpless beings inside. The airborne cars smashed with the storefronts and gift shops. Smoke poured out of the crater that once was a gas station. No one even had the chance to scream before the cars on the road went up like bottle rockets. Still, several limbs and jagged metal fell from the sky. Blood poured down like acid rain. The hospital rocked on its foundation. All the windows on the west side facing the explosion shattered, and the people were thrust backward with such force. The sky had gone red with fire and soot, and the clouds swirled above the curling smoke. A flaming truck struck the Twin Creek clock tower, which crumbled in a cloud of dust and brick. For only a moment, unseen to everyone in Twin Creek, 2 massive eyes opened in the clouds, shining with red light darker than the fires below. Back at the apartment, Phoebe watched the sun rise in the east. She was standing upon her condo balcony. She looked down at the road, waiting for Brandon to return. It was her suspicion that he had gone back to the hospital to check on the woman. She would have gone out herself if it weren't for the reports on the news. A man had been found at a nearby construction site, convulsing violently. He said he was bitten on the neck and was covered in black bruises. But what baffled her the most was that the worker had been reported dead earlier that afternoon. Just around sundown, the man had to be restrained to a stretcher, and that hadn't been the last report. Before she lost complete power in the apartment, she bit down on her nails. "Where are you?" she asked the sky, which she noticed was filling with dark clouds. She looked back inside the apartment, where her paintings leaned against the wall by the door, her paint sets and brushes spread out across the carpet. Seeing her paintings hanging upside down on the wall had been too much for her, and she hadn't wasted a minute in tearing them down one by one. 2 police cruisers sped by the apartment building, lights flashing, horns blaring. She frowned to herself. Then she heard an enormous explosion on the other side of town. A black stack of smoke invaded the sky and Phoebe screamed. She was about to run back inside when she spotted Brandon on the street, striding toward the front of the building. He still wore his work coveralls and boots. Where his car was, she didn't know, but he was there, walking calmly. Phoebe found her breath again. Her eyes flitted to the brushes on the floor, and then down at the top of her boyfriend's head as it ducked inside the building. Only seconds later, too fast for any human, Brandon opened the door and walked inside the apartment. She felt pins sting uncomfortably against her chest. They lived on the 5th floor of their building, and it didn't have an elevator. There was Brandon, but he had changed somewhere in the seconds between the street and her door. His black hair was clotted with blood, and his work uniform hung off in charred rags, revealing black flesh underneath. He seemed to be smoking. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and he had his head pointed toward the ground. He was barefoot, and there were long shards of glass protruding from the top of his foot. His red hand shut the door behind him with a loud slam. His face reared up in her direction, and she saw that his nose was missing, painting most of his face black with blood. His eyes were literally bugging out of their sockets, red from the smoke and bleeding. Phoebe screeched and drew back, stepping out onto the balcony. Brandon's cheek was sliced open, and Phoebe could see into his mouth. His tongue moved steadily behind blood-stained teeth. One fang stuck out of his cheek like a walrus tooth. His eyes were what scared Phoebe the most. They seemed to sneak into her head and push around at the thoughts inside. She could hear his heavy breathing, but it was in her mind. She could also hear him whispering something inside, restlessly prodding away at her thoughts. The whispering stopped and the laughing commenced. This was not the laughter of the man she loved. What she heard inside her brain was like a power drill, harsh and powerful. "You had something to tell me, honey?" the man said through his elongated fangs. They dripped blood onto the carpet. She muttered something, but he cut her off. "Shut up. Let me talk for once. And don't you even think of interrupting me," the thing hissed. "I don't." Phoebe's eyes rolled as the alien fingers sorted through her mind. She felt them pulling, picking at her brains. Phoebe felt her mind go to mush. In her head she screamed. The creature smiled, its teeth elongating like tusks inside its cheeks. The laughing started up again in Phoebe's head. "Brandon, whatever you are." "Please, darling, don't be upset," it cackled, reaching down to the ground for a paintbrush. "It's 7 o'clock, honey. I'm tired." Phoebe looked up and saw Brandon approaching her with the blunt end of the paintbrush. "Please, Phoebe, don't be like this," it continued. It came within 2 feet of Phoebe and whipped backward as soon as the sunlight shined in its eyes. Brandon hissed. Its eyes reduced themselves to small red holes in its skull. Phoebe saw her moment and leapt to her bare feet. She tried to circle around Brandon to reach the door. He snatched at her with incredible speed. Its hand wrapped around Phoebe's neck and threw her into the opposite wall, into one of her canvas paintings. The painting snapped into 2 pieces as Phoebe struck the wall. In a flash, Brandon was on her, and with teeth inside her neck. Her first instinct was to grab at the hand that wielded the paintbrush. She held it back, but the end of the brush handle was inches from her eyeball. The thing struck at her with its other hand. The sharp nails scratched across her cheek, immediately drawing beads of blood. She was able to overpower the hand and wrench the brush from its wet fingers. She then drove the blunt end into Brandon's left eye. There was a squishing sound, and then it lodged into something stiff and wet. She was sprayed with hot juice. "You bitch! You fucking bitch!" She shoved him as hard as she could off her, and he tumbled into the wooden banister behind him. Before she could pull herself off the floor, Brandon was already on his feet, bent over and hissing. At that, she sprang at the balcony in front of her, palms out and ready, her entire body strength swelling up rapidly. Phoebe screamed, connecting her hands with his chest. She shoved him hard, and the railing gave out behind him, sending him falling through space. Brandon disappeared from view, and then there was a tremendous crack as he collided with the pavement 5 stories below. His head had smashed like a melon, the brush still protruding from the bloody mass. His broken legs lay twisted, his fist still clutching at the brush handle. Phoebe didn't see him fall. She fell backward against the screen door, gasping for air. She looked down at her shirt, now stained red from the wound in her neck. She hit the floor and crawled toward her artwork, askew on the carpet. Before she died, she looked into a painting she'd based on a chilling dream she once had. Now it made sense to her. Her hand touched the delicate canvas as she realized what it was of. "Twin Creek," she murmured. The painting depicted a glorious mountainside. The grass on the hill was dead, and the mountainside was covered in dark shadows from a black cloud in the sky. In the clouds were 2 red eyes that seemed to watch over the darkness. She had titled the painting, "The Curse." Her head fell over on her arm, and her palm slid from the canvas, revealing a dripping handprint of blood. The Demon's Rapture, Chapter 1. Raymond awoke. The hospital room was empty and dark, too empty, too dark. It was daytime, he could tell from the lines of sunshine through the shades across his window. But something wasn't right about this sunshine, something that made Raymond feel like it wasn't the sun at all, as if something was blocking it, something that wasn't letting the sun do its job. He closed his eyes and shuffled through his last few memories, which felt something like dreams. He could remember the hospital, but why was he there? All he had to reference was the faded memory of his pickup truck, the steering wheel to be exact. He remembered gripping it tight as he braced himself for impact. He remembered how his teeth had rattled inside his head. Yes, the car accident. It could have been worse. It had left him with only a concussion and some tightness in his back. He was on his way out of town when a car slammed into him through a red light, operated by a driver whom Raymond was quite sure was already dead before the collision. He couldn't remember much from there, but he remembered why he was speeding out of town. That morning Jesus Christ had appeared before him in his dream, although it was the most realistic vision he'd ever had. In the dream, Raymond stood in his living room, which was empty. He somehow knew the entire house was empty and his wife and son were gone. As soon as he realized this, he screamed and ran out his door. On his doorstep stood the image of a glowing man of intense golden light, and its brightness was enough to blind Raymond momentarily. He never got a clear image of Christ's face through the sheen, but Raymond did feel an overwhelming wash of love that almost seemed to lull him into sleep. The Christ spread his arms and a scarlet light burned within his chest like a torch. A soothing male voice spoke to him, and Raymond could not tell if the mirage before him was even moving his lips. Still, he heard the message loud and clear, and even after processing it, after his carnal urge to scream and cry, the Christ gave him love. "Laura and George have left this world, Raymond. You are here to contend with the opening of the 7 seals, my revelation at the end of time and death," the voice told him without tone and without emotion. "The Rapture is here, and those you love and idolize have returned to my kingdom of heaven, now free from death. May you find my light to carry you home, but first you must die, and the dead will meet you. This is your last day. Until midnight of the 2nd day, you will be judged." Before Raymond could plead for mercy, the Christ stepped backward into a curtain of light that swept him out of existence and Raymond out of his sleep. It was morning and Raymond woke up in bed, but Laura was missing from his side. His son George was gone as well, his bedroom door still closed. Laura's car was still in the garage and all her clothing was in place, leaving everything untouched from the day before. They were just gone, no note or dishes in the sink, only ruffled bed sheets. The phone was dead and there was no power in the house. Raymond could remember his dream, but his rational mind told him something horrible had happened to his family, never mind the vision. They were in the hospital, or something worse. Still dressed in his pajamas, Raymond hurried out of his house and into his truck. He set a course for the hospital, and that was precisely where he ended up, only in the back of the ambulance. He didn't make it far into town before the other driver blind swiped him into unconsciousness. Raymond got out of the hospital bed, pulling the plugs of oxygen from his nostrils. He went over to the window and felt a slight breeze as it fluttered across his lower back. He wore a white cotton hospital gown, open in the back. It was splattered with someone else's blood and had many red handprints on it. Come to think of it, there were bloody prints everywhere. Equipment was thrown aside and a gurney lay broken and overturned in the corner. Blood dripped from the wall in frozen splatters. Raymond turned his attention back to the blinds and threw them open in one yank of his wrist. He was right. The sun wasn't shining. It was daylight and the sun wasn't out. Dark rain clouds filled the sky in a broad paintbrush stroke. Raymond couldn't even see the mountains. The streets were completely empty, not a person to be seen, but there were a lot of cars. Some cars were overturned and still smoking. Some cars protruded from the front of nearby buildings like spears. The road was torn apart, brick and rock lining the streets like decoration. The street was torn down the middle with a spiderweb crack. Buildings had collapsed into piles of brick and ash, blanketing the entire street in a winter storm. Where's the help? Raymond thought. If this bad of an accident happened, then where is everyone? Raymond left the window with tear-strewn eyes and walked toward the closed door. He opened it slowly and entered the ghost town of a lobby. The front desk down the hall was unmanned, and he couldn't hear the normal orchestra of a hospital, of squeaking shoes or the hiss of medical equipment. There were no souls around. Raymond stepped out of his room, the cold linoleum stinging his bare feet to the point of numbness. The rooms along the hall were closed up tight. Trash, body limbs, clothing, gurneys, and more buckets of blood splattered the lobby. The fluorescent lights above him flickered and died for a minute. They shot back on and flickered again. Raymond tried for one of the room's door handles and found it locked. He tried another, locked. Another, locked. He stepped carefully the other way, toward the reception desk and toward a pair of double doors. He peeked over the front desk and found nothing. Pencils and papers were scattered around the floor and desk. Blood stained the carpet and he found a shotgun that looked to be loaded. He thought about taking it for protection when he spotted the phone on the desk, which had been torn from its cradle. Raymond grabbed the cordless phone and checked that its battery pack was still intact. Then he checked for a dial tone. Hello? Hello, this line is no longer in service. Hello, this line is no longer in service. A mechanical female voice repeated over and over again. Yeah, I think I get the point. Hello, this line is no longer in service. Raymond set the phone down on the desk. He didn't even bother to turn it off. Then he threw open the swinging double doors. The lights above him snuffed out like a candle and they didn't flicker back on. Raymond stopped abruptly, chest heaving, breath thinning. He stood silent in the stunned darkness and could hear the phone off in the background. But it wasn't the woman's recording he was hearing. It was the piercing ee that a phone makes after it hasn't been turned off. Raymond went through the open doors and caught some natural sunlight, seeping through the wall-length window in front of him. Wind whipped at him from the open window and he shivered in his robe. Then Raymond fell against the swinging doors with surprise. All around him were the dead bodies of men and women. Some lay half in and out of the open elevators, and some lay decapitated on the floor in front of him. Raymond realized that he had stepped onto a floor stained with flowing blood. There were bullet holes all along the walls and in the elevator doors. Please, God, don't let the lights come back on. I don't want to see those bodies in the light. Please, God, no. The lights above him rebooted, and the elevator doors immediately started to open and close on their own. The stench reached Raymond's nostrils, and he winced in displeasure. It was the smell of burning hair and strong chemicals. Raymond realized that it wasn't just from the lobby he stood in, but the horrible smell was on the air, wafting in through the window. Raymond stepped shakily over the dead and stood by the opening and closing elevator doors. He chose one with the least amount of bullet holes and nudged the body of a man away from the door with his toes. He got inside and let the doors close around him. There were no bodies in there, but it was rife with holes and blood. It smelled like spoiled eggs, and it reminded Raymond of a leaky basement. He punched the ground floor button and the elevator trembled vigorously. Then it began to move steadily down the elevator shaft. Raymond closed his eyes, hoping to God that the power didn't go out again. Ding! The elevator door swung open and Raymond fled from the metal tomb and into an identical lobby, complete with the same devastation. Raymond gave the elevator doors a hurried glance as they shut with a snap. The elevator began its ascent back up the shaft. Silence. It was too silent. Raymond found himself running in circles through the maze-like corridors and hallways, searching endlessly for the exit. Whenever he came to an intersection of hallways, he'd frantically pick a passageway into a new set of corridors. The first floor was even worse than the fifth. Raymond noticed a lot of ash and burnt rubble from some kind of explosion. He passed by a few windows that were set high up on the walls. There was no way he could climb through them, though the glass was blown out. Raymond turned left toward the front desk, where he knew he'd find the exit. He followed a long, winding corridor and into the ER waiting room. He burst outside and ran away from the building, pushing his way past the onslaught of overturned cars and piles of burnt rubble. From behind him, he heard the doors of the hospital close. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He ran to the other side of the street, across a surface hot enough to scorch his bare feet. The parking lot was full, so he took the precautions of moving low behind the cars to hide him from outside eyes. He took a moment to catch his breath and look back at the hospital. It was now bathed in the shadow of the dark clouds, and like a blanket that had been pulled over his head, he felt his world go silent, left only with the ringing in his ears. The light resembled the cool moonlight hours, even though the watch on his wrist told him it was 2:30 in the afternoon. As Raymond should have expected, the rain pelted down from the clouds. All the windows in the hospital were drawn shut with blinds. Some windows were blown inwards, but still had the blinds fluttering neatly in the cool breeze. Raymond didn't wait for the blinds to be pulled back to reveal the pale faces inside. He couldn't help but think of all the closed doors on the 5th floor and what might be behind them. He allowed the cold rain to wash over his sore face and soothe his feet. From the drops off his beard, Raymond drank the rainwater greedily and savored the weight of his stomach again. He found the exit to the parking lot and jogged down the street, where he knew he would meet with an intersection of the 4 major roads in town. When he reached the intersection, where the bodies of the dead and the rubble choked all sides of the road, he charted his next course. He hoped that his dream was accurate and his family had safely escaped the nightmare. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to get out either, but if that meant his death, he would fight it to his last breath. If he could keep fighting, he would do so, though he understood one thing. Before he could surrender to the apocalypse at midnight, whatever that might be, he would return home one last time and make sure Laura or George weren't there. They might have found a safe way back to the house to wait for him. Only then could he go in peace. He decided to take Broadway from there to find another way around. His feet splashed in the quickly forming puddles. Rain poured down his face and neck. If this rain keeps up, there's bound to be a flood, Raymond thought. The thunder roared in agreement over his head, and the clouds broke open in a joyous snarl. Chapter 2. Raymond stopped at a restaurant that sat at the end of Boulder Avenue. Its windows were smashed in, leaving jagged pieces of glass to stand upright in the frame like teeth. The glass was stained with blood from the fingers that had forced it open. Raymond had stopped at the restaurant to find someone alive to help him, and to duck temporarily out of the rain. The window in front of him was large, stretching from the sidewalk to the top of the diner. Raymond stepped easily through the window and inside. He teetered into the diner and spied through the darkness. The restaurant was in tatters. The tables were thrown to opposite corners of the room and were either snapped into splinters or smeared with blood. There weren't any bodies Raymond could see, and he counted himself blessed. But the stink was there, just as it had been in the hospital. He stepped and winced in a hot scorch of pain that twisted itself up his thigh and into his groin. He looked down and suppressed the urge to scream. His bare foot had just stepped into a litter of broken shards. Raymond lifted up his leg in a cartoon reflex and stumbled backward. He hobbled into a crouched position to catch his breath, and his other foot crunched down on the same bed of glass. He bounced away from the glass and the window, and still managed to press on with his tiptoes. He slid into a seat at one of the open booths, which was relatively clean, and lifted his leg to inspect his foot. The damage proved only minor cuts on the surface, and he took his time in using his thumb and forefinger to pry the rogue glass shards from his flesh. In a matter of minutes he was free of pain, and he applied pressure with his hands. He took a look at his other foot and was thankful he'd be okay. He breathed a sigh of relief to be out of the rain. Outside, the thunder boomed and rain pelted in through the open window. Raymond stared at the excess rainwater, splashing and trickling over the floor in a hypnotic gurgle. He looked at the table attached to the booth, which was scattered with empty pretzels, beer nuts, and napkins. One napkin was hammered into the wood with a nail, and someone had scrawled something in chicken scratch on the faded surface. The skies opened in a smile, and those eyes I can't forget tore through the clouds. I know there will be no military or disaster relief. This was no disease. This was hell on earth. This is the apocalypse. I'm a God-fearing man, and the Lord has forsaken me, left me to die while those I love are free. There were red eyes in the sky looking at us, studying us. Raymond stopped reading and hung his head in silent prayer, ending the task with a simple gesture of the cross with his arms. Raymond tore the napkin from the tabletop and went to the door of the diner. There was a small calendar nestled on a nail with pictures of cheerleaders, and he dropped the calendar from the door to hang the napkin in its place. Whenever help decided to come, they'd see the note, though he knew the chances didn't even exist. Raymond jumped as the rain turned to sleet with large hailstones the size of marbles. They clicked and splattered heavily on the roof, as if knocking to get in. Raymond backed up into the shadows of the restaurant beyond the dining area. The lightning outside peeled across the clouds, reflecting through the glass in a whirlwind of blue fire. The window moved up and down on the wall as the world was shaking, an earthquake to bring the building down on his head, but Raymond steadied himself against the wall and breathed. He cowered against the farthest corner of the restaurant, which he didn't even care was marked with someone else's blood. Then he felt a chill run up his calf. He looked down idly, his peripherals still fixed on the toothless window. Nothing is the same anymore. Oh God, everything is alive and you're on the cliff over hell. He was standing in blood that was still flowing. Blood trickled through his toes like stream water, leaving red streaks on his feet. Raymond squirmed helplessly in place before he heard a stifled moan from the other corner, beneath an upset table and chairs. A black hump stirred there, and it was writhing in a sick spasm, just like a dying animal. Raymond stepped out of the red puddle and edged against the wall to get a closer look at the dark mass. Out of the darkness, 2 headlights of red fluorescent shined across the ceiling and walls. A man convulsed furiously in the far corner, hands beating at the hardwood floor. The red eyes rotated in his head like moving mechanical pieces. The cords and strands in his neck bulged. His lips curled over like hot wax, his teeth exposed and red. His nails scratched away at the wood floor, leaving deep grooves like a cat's claws. Raymond did not want to watch it, yet he couldn't take his eyes off the show. He pasted his back against the wall, his spine arching into the wallpaper. His head reared away from the scene, mouth open, but his eyes fixed. The man started to screech hoarsely, fist pounding at the earth like a ravenous ape. His eyes bulged with glassy exteriors, and Raymond was sure they were going to pop right out of his head. His mouth spilled more blood onto the floor. Raymond watched the man change in front of him from a corpse and into a blinking and breathing monster who snorted like a bull. It seemed to be weak and half asleep, rolling fitfully in its slumber, though its eyes were wide open. Its mouth opened and closed over a pink tongue, and the blue lips met and peeled apart. The arms became steady at his sides and then lifeless. His legs hardened into rigid staffs, and his head fell over onto his shoulders. His eyes closed and didn't open again. The body looked so peaceful there for a second, but Raymond knew the thing wasn't dead. It breathed raggedly. It snorted and whined. Raymond remembered what the Christ had told him in his dream. The dead will meet me. Is that how it is now? Raymond asked himself. To be punished with a perpetual death, sleepwalking and slumbering in a hell on earth? And will that be my midnight, to come back as one of them? He wondered when the thing's eyes would open again, to assemble this horrid new world. When would it regain its feet and exercise life back into its paralyzed arms and legs? Raymond didn't want to find out. He slid away from the wall and considered the tangle of chairs and overturned tables to his right. He heard the man groan and drag his nails across the floor. Raymond shifted his body weight to his knees and hid low to the ground behind the wreckage, peeking through a crack. Suddenly the man's head came into view as he stood upright. Raymond didn't want to look at the man's face, but he found it inevitable. Pupils in the man's red eyes shrank back into a camera's zoom. Then the man's hands went up to each side of his neck, and with one swift blurred movement, he cracked his neck first left and then right. Then he smiled, revealing sharp teeth. Raymond's body broke out in goose flesh. The creature sniffed the air, nostrils flaring crazily. Raymond ducked his head, and when he dared to look again, the man was gone, already stepping outside the window. He heard the man's shoes crunch with the glass. Raymond got up as quickly as he could and poked his head out the window and into the rain. Raymond saw a figure emerge from the fog at the end of the street, walking toward the restaurant, and it was covered with black blood. It didn't even look at the shops on either side as it strode casually by with a fixed intensity. More figures passed through the fog. The rain had begun to let up, reduced to a light drizzle. All the monsters were headed the same way, the way Raymond needed to go. They were all moving deeper into town. A humming woman in her 30s passed the window, and Raymond pressed himself against the wall, out of sight. The woman's head tilted to the side as she passed, and Raymond saw her red eyes strain to their corners as she spotted him. But she neither gave any indication that she cared, nor that she knew he was there. She tilted her head back and walked on down the street. She knew I was here. She saw me out of the corner of her eyes. Why didn't she attack me? Raymond asked himself. The dead will meet you, he heard inside his head. He edged closer, careful not to step on any of the glass. He got a better look at his travelers and saw they were all walking the same speed. He saw a mother and her toddler walking side by side, giving no indication that they were related at all. Their clothes were in tatters, burned and stained. The fog swept out of the town like a hand through a screen of smoke. Raymond could see the entire street, and it was streaming with people, elbow to elbow in a death march. There were at least 200 in view and still more to come, rolling in like a tide of joggers in a marathon line, although they were all in a discernible hurry. These people were familiar to Raymond. These were Raymond's neighbors and friends, now lost in their own shell of a body. Raymond gasped as he watched his son's 12-year-old friend strut across the sidewalk on the other end of the street. He hissed to himself, hobbling on the mangled mess of a leg. Raymond watched astonished as the undead marched through the rain, headed west. Some were smiling, others talking to themselves in dreamlike murmurs. Their gaze remained fixed forever forward. New lightning blew up and burned out with bright white flashes. Raymond jumped as the awaited thunder boomed forth, but the dead were not disturbed. More lightning illuminated the sky. Another man passed by the window so close that Raymond got a whiff of his rotting skin. He backed away from the window and made sure that he had good leeway to the back door if a problem should arise. Raymond tiptoed to the back door, hoping for an alleyway he could escape through. The door was unlocked and Raymond fell against it, revealing a loaded dock with a few dumpsters and a chain-link fence. He stepped into an ice-cold rain puddle and drew back suddenly.
It felt quite cooling after the initial shock. He stepped again onto the gravel. Raymond took a deep breath and allowed the rain to wash over him, pasting his gown to his skin in an airtight seal. Raymond shuddered from the cold and wrapped his arms close to his chest to keep warm. In this way, he chose the straightest route home, through the litter-strewn streets and the alleys washed with blood. Even though he had to dodge from one alleyway to the other across a street corner or through an intersection, he remained alone. The flood of dead men and women had quickly vacated the streets, and Raymond hoped to do the same. The Demon's Rapture. Chapter 3. Although he remained alert, he did not bump into anyone else, living or dead. Well into the neighborhood streets, the world seemed a lot quieter, and there was less destruction on the streets. Many of the houses appeared ransacked and gutted, the doors standing open, and some had smoke wafting through their windows in vacuum drafts. With the horrors of downtown behind him, he approached his house, the second to last on the block, and suppressed tears at the sight of it. All the windows had been smashed and its furniture lay scattered and burned on the front lawn, as if an explosion had blasted them out of the windows. He poked through the remains of his own clothing and bedsheets, smoldering in the wet grass. Inside the house, he found a disaster of trash and refuse, and could smell gunpowder on the air. He called the name of his wife and son as he moved from room to room, finding nothing more than the remains of his life, smashed and ground into the shag carpet. He dared to walk up the stairs, stepping over the broken handrail and calling vainly the names of his family, whom he knew were far from earshot. That didn't prevent him from scouring each room, closing the doors after him, one by one. Back in the street outside his house, he looked up and down the block, wondering what he should do. He had no intention of going back into that house, not without Laura or George, and he sure as hell didn't want to stand in the street all night. With tears in his eyes, Raymond looked at his watch. It was 4 in the afternoon, leaving 8 more hours until the end, if he was to believe the prophecy in his dream. He gasped for breath, his throat constricting with choking sobs. Hyperventilating, he struggled to stay on his feet, and then cried out, doubling over with a splitting coughing fit. He heard voices yell out to him, and he looked up to see faces in the upstairs window of his neighbor's house, and they were smiling at him, laughing and yelling. He knew these people. They were calling for him to come inside. The front door had already opened, and hands were gesturing to him there. Gratefully, he limped inside, and the door was shut behind him, followed by a barricade of bookshelves and desks. The middle-aged woman standing before him was Margaret, a short, overweight woman who lived in the house with her husband and son. The young man pushing the barricades in place was her 19-year-old son, whose name escaped him at the moment. Raymond thanked them profusely, shivering in his surprisingly warm company. Looking around the house, he found that it stood in good shape, with the broken windows boarded up with wooden planks, giving the house a calm dimming effect, like crawling inside a cave. There were more people standing on the stairs, waiting for Raymond. There was Todd, the neighbor from across the street, and Jack from the next block. They were worse for wear, pale and skittish. Todd looked to be injured, his long sleeves ripped off and tight round his shoulders to stop the bleeding there. Whether it was helping or not was not clear by the red color on his makeshift bandage. They led him upstairs and into the attic, where Raymond had seen them peeking from the window. There was one other survivor laying down on a cot in the attic, an elderly woman with a white sheet pulled up to her chin. Her face was ashen white and tight, giving Raymond the impression of a corpse, but the woman's chest rose and fell with her shallow breathing. Raymond didn't know the woman personally, but he had seen her sitting on the porch of a house a few doors down. She lived with her daughter, whom Raymond didn't see in the attic with the rest. He counted heads. There were 5 in all. Jack handed Raymond a bundle of blankets and encouraged him to change out of his wet clothes. Raymond nodded his head, but only managed to drape the heavy comforter over his shoulders and sit down on the floor in a warm bundle. The other survivors watched him gravely. "Where did you come from?" Margaret asked. "The hospital," he managed to say. Todd passed him a bottle of water, still cold, and he drank from it gratefully, handing it back half-finished. "Did you see any people?" She seemed to be careful how she framed the question, and Raymond understood why. "None that I can really call people," he answered dryly. She nodded slowly, looking at Jack, who hung his head and sat down on the edge of the cot with the elderly woman. Margaret's son had just finished pushing a bureau over the trapdoor into the attic, which was enough to settle Raymond's nerves, not that he was afraid of anyone trying to get in. The monsters walking around in the streets didn't seem to be concerned with any activity besides their destination, and if there were bad men out there looting and hurting people, then Raymond had just missed them. It looked like a quarantine area out there, minutes after total evacuation. Raymond couldn't rule that out just yet. Perhaps the disaster was only central to his town, or his state, and nowhere else. Maybe help was on its way. "Laura? And George?" Margaret asked. Raymond shook his head. "They were missing this morning. I went out to find them, and I was rushed to the hospital. This is how I woke up." "And let me guess, you had a dream?" Tom said from the window. He turned his back on Raymond and looked out. "This is Revelation, and we're all being punished. It occurred to Raymond at that moment that none of the people in the attic deserved to be in their situation. He knew Margaret well enough. She volunteered a lot of her time at the community center, organizing charity events for underprivileged kids. Her son was a valedictorian with a scholarship to a medical school next year, with a passion for helping people and saving lives. Todd was a counselor at the high school and helped teenagers cope with peer harassment and parental abuse. Jack was retired at the age of 50 and had 3 beautiful children, adopted from abusive households. Raymond couldn't help but notice he was alone. Without any of his family members by his side, Raymond would find out that each one of them had lost somebody to the Rapture. Margaret had lost her husband, Todd his wife, Jack his wife and kids, and the elderly woman in the cot, named Mrs. Tinley, had lost her entire family, daughter and granddaughters alike. "But you, Ray," Todd said with disbelief, "I thought you were safe for sure with your family. I mean, you're the most charitable man in the neighborhood. I always see you at church, lending help wherever you can." "And why are we left while our families are gone?" Jack asked from the cot. He was honestly looking at Raymond for an answer, who could only look away and regard the far wall. "We're not bad people. It just doesn't make sense," Todd said. He placed his hand on the window and pressed his forehead against it. "What exactly did you dream?" Raymond asked. Margaret was the only one to meet his eyes, so he followed up his question with her. "Did we all see the same thing?" "Well, if you saw Christ, then we did too," she responded. "He told us we were to suffer the apocalypse while our families would be freed." "And how did this all start?" Raymond asked. "There was a lot of violence," Margaret said. "I tried not to look outside, and we held up in here. People were trying to make their escape, but the traffic made it impossible for people to leave," Margaret's son continued. He sat down next to Raymond, with his back against the wall. He stared up at the ceiling in deep thought. "I heard the violence was worse in town. You must have seen it for yourself." Raymond could only nod. "What else did you see?" The boy looked Raymond in the eyes. "I saw a dead man get up and walk away," Raymond said with a sick feeling in his stomach. "There were hundreds of them, all walking toward the center of town. They were all dead, bleeding, and they had red eyes," Jack said. "I saw them walking around outside. Once the looters quieted down, those zombies started taking to the streets, all walking in the same direction." Raymond sat up with interest. "Where are they going?" "I've heard there's a bottomless pit in the center of the town, and they're all walking into it, like they're hypnotized or something," the kid explained. "Where did you hear this?" Raymond had to ask. "There was someone in our group. He said he escaped the crowd downtown, where people were being trampled in the streets, just trying to run across the city limits." The kid stared at his hands, tugging on his own fingers. "He said he saw the ground open up with fire. The dead were getting up off the street and walking in." "What happened to him?" "He was badly hurt." Margaret hesitated to answer for her son, who looked grateful to accept the silence. "He died of his wounds downstairs. We had to take him outside so he couldn't bother us in here. An hour later the lawn was bare, and the sheet we rolled him in was empty. He just got up and joined the crowd." "They don't even notice us, or don't even care," Todd said. "I've stood here at this window and yelled down at them as they walk by. Usually they look up, just to see who it is. But they never move toward the house or look angry. They even smile before they look away and ignore me completely." "What does that mean? That they don't attack us?" Jack questioned. "It might not mean anything," Todd replied with a shrug of his injured shoulder. "Would we expect them to attack us? How should we know what to expect from actual zombies in the street?" "What if this is a test, to see who can survive the longest?" Margaret's son asked suddenly, but only half the room had heard him. They all had questions to be answered. "What if these dead people are possessed by demons?" Margaret said. "What do you think will happen at midnight?" Todd asked. "Why would God do this to us?" "What did we do?" Raymond stood up and caught all of their eyes. "Please, we need to think of a way out of this," Todd scoffed, turning around to face him. "Where could we escape? We only have a few hours left." "We could find help in the next town," Raymond sighed, aware that his words were falling upon deaf ears. "What if there are other survivors out there? For God's sake, we have to try something. The fact that we have so little time makes it that much more important. We just can't sit around here and wait for the 4 horsemen. I'm not sure there are other survivors, but they won't be surviving for long." That came from Margaret's son. He did not sound happy with what he had just said, but he spoke it as though it was the truth. "We can't leave Mrs. Tinley here," Margaret replied sadly. She motioned toward the sleeping woman in the cot. "She's too weak to walk, and we can't just carry her out there." Raymond nodded that he understood and sat down again. The room seemed to settle with the new change of nervous energy, which acted like a ticking clock for their background. Raymond hung his head and waited, bracing his back against the wall. In this way, he fell asleep instantly. Chapter 4. Raymond woke up to the sound of scuffling feet and a crying woman. It was dark, only a shred of natural light from the moon outside the window, and he was able to read his watch. It was only a few minutes before midnight, and his neighborhood was just as quiet as before, except for the new excitement in the attic. He sat up straight to watch Margaret pulling her son back by the arms, begging him through her tears to stop. Jack and Todd had just entered the fray and were trying to calm them both down. The kid looked to be in the process of moving the piece of furniture from the trapdoor. "Mom, I'm going out there," the kid screamed at Margaret, who only cried louder. "There's nothing keeping me here, or you. Let me go out there and face whatever it is instead of hiding in this fucking attic. Raymond's right." Raymond looked at Mrs. Tinley, still breathing soundly in her bed. "We can talk about this," Todd said. He grabbed for the kid, but he pushed Todd away into the wall. "Don't touch me," he screamed. Raymond stood up, balancing himself against the wall and allowing the comforter to slip off his shoulders. "Come on," he said. "Let's stop this." The kid heaved open the door and Jack caught him in the headlock, struggling to pull him back. Margaret screeched and something heavy was overturned. Raymond was able to watch Margaret as she fell backward against a pile of boxes in the corner, landing in a dusty heap. Her son sprang after her, with Jack dragging him down like an anchor. In this way, they both fell over, smashing the kid face first into the hardwood floor. The entire attic shook and Raymond scrambled to pull Jack off. Raymond leaned forward and received a blind elbow in the face, and he scurried away into the wall, banging his head painfully. Todd hurried to his side, apologizing for hitting him accidentally. Somewhere Margaret was whining under her breath, calling her son's name, who was now unresponsive. Jack was able to carry the boy to a bundle of blankets on the floor and leave him there. "God damn it," he cried, checking the boy's pulse. Margaret and Raymond stood by helplessly, holding their breaths. "Is he alive?" Raymond cried. Jack cursed again and Todd shoved him aside to inspect the boy's face, which was complete with a broken nose and some missing teeth. The boy struggled to breathe through the bubbles of blood through his mouth, and Todd quickly wiped his face clean and rolled him over on his side. "What did you do? What did you do?" Margaret screamed at Jack, pounding on his head with her open hands. He tried to crawl away from her, hands over his head. In the corner, Mrs. Tinley shot out of her sleep, eyes glassy and staring. She shrieked, and everyone grew silent. They watched as the room filled with bright light, sliding over the walls and ceiling like cool vapor, and easing them all into submissive positions, sitting on the floor with their muscles giving way. Here was the figure from their dreams, now standing before them, a foot above Mrs. Tinley's cot. The figure seemed to wear the light as his robes, shrouding himself in starlight, and the radiation from the sun, and the reflection of the moon. He spread his arms to envelop the room, and they felt the man's unconditional love for them, and only for them. Raymond realized that their group was the most important alliance left on the planet, and the last show on Earth was for them. But now it was all going to be fine. They would be delivered safely home to their waiting families. Mrs. Tinley shrieked again as she stared up at the man enshrouded in light, and her eyes rolled back in her head. The Christ figure reached down for her and managed to take her hand in his. Mrs. Tinley was drooling, foaming at the mouth, and her head lolled to the side. "Do not be afraid," the man said. "I have come to lead you far from here. You are the last survivors in your town, and you should not be here to witness the end." Margaret burst into tears of joy, rejoicing in thanks and bowing her head in prayer. Todd and Jack stared in awe at the figure from their knees, and Raymond couldn't even find his breath. He kept trying to peer through the glare and see Christ's features, his eyes or his mouth, the thin bridge of his nose or his dark locks of hair, but the light was too intense, and he found he couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds. "Take a hold of my robes now, while your son needs saving. I will take us into heaven, where you may be reunited with your loved ones." Margaret did not need to be asked twice. She took her son's hand, and then reached up to take a handful of Jesus' robes, which settled in her palm like a tail of mist. Todd and Jack reached out with both their hands and hung on to the figure's robes. Todd buried his face in the white light, and half of his body appeared to disappear as if dunking his head underwater. "And you, Raymond, will you not take my hand and follow me home?" the voice asked him, speaking from inside his mind. "You take me home now?" Raymond said. "After all this, you come for us now?" The light intensified around the glowing man, and Raymond felt his eyes droop, muscles reduced to putty. "Will you refuse a reunion with your wife and child?" Christ asked. "Come now, Raymond, take my hand." He felt his stomach turn around inside him, the ground dropping out under his knees. Fingers touched his face, cold and scaly. They were Christ's hands, and they were wrapping around his throat. "You survived, Raymond," the voice said. "You came this far, but you cannot go any further. Time to sleep, and you'll be with your family when you wake." He was drifting down, and those fingers were tightening around his flesh, reeling him forward. Through a fog lens, he watched the figure extend several more arms from his chest, which clamped their incandescent claws across every other survivor's throat, even the old woman. They were all subdued, catatonic, and staring into the bright light. The arms retracted into the figure's robes, taking the survivors with it. "No!" Raymond screamed, and the figure started back, the light flickering around its body. "I demand for you to stop this!" The pressure around his neck loosened, and Raymond pulled back, landing on his feet. He shielded his eyes from the light with a heavy hand. "I demand that you show yourself, demon!" Raymond cried. "Show us your true form!" Then the light snuffed out in an instant, and Raymond found himself in a dimly lit attic, pooled with moonlight. The figure standing before him was no longer robed or holy. It was hunched over and smoking like a match. Raymond hiccuped in fear, his knees finally buckling under him. He slid down the wall behind him with a slight squeak. The figure stood upright and the face was revealed. It resembled a man with ink-black skin and red eyes, glowing like two red hot coals from his skull. His mouth was drawn back savagely to show off his decaying teeth. As if his body was a torch that had just been ignited, flames licked up his back and through his hair. Flames melted away his face, and Raymond could hear his flesh sizzle and smell it as it burned. His hair wasn't affected by the fire. His black locks swung along his shoulders in a mesmerizing fashion, like there was a breeze tickling his back. The eyes seemed to split like eggshells, and they were filled with electricity. They shone brightly with a magnificent red light, pulsing like diodes in the darkness. Blood oozed from his burns and his forehead, yet his smile never faltered. The fire licked around his robes, but his clothing did not burn like his skin. He wasn't actually on fire. He had created the flames somehow, produced them like natural sweat. His nose creased down sharply and his cheeks became rugged desert landscapes. Large black shadows spawned from the ends of his eyes, his teeth chipping away from their lifeless black gums. The flames on his back grew brighter and bigger as he changed. His serpent tongue flicked out between his charred lips, black and rotting with green mold. The creature's eyes dug into Raymond's skull and prodded at his thoughts with a fire poker of immense heat. Raymond tried to scream, but the pain in his body was unbearable. Raymond could hear millions of voices hissing in his mind, all the voices of the dead, and they were happy he was dying. Finally dying. The figure's eyes grew as big as pulsing suns, each with tiny pupils that shrank and expanded randomly. Raymond's knees caved in and he fell onto his back. The demon's face cracked like a piece of porcelain as his mouth opened wide. The eyes were swimming with sparks of color, all the colors imaginable. Raymond cried out savagely inside his mind, but the voices only screamed back in return. He could hear the choir of the damned, a million unholy voices laughing within his mind, prodding and poking. The demon screamed with pain as fire consumed his entire body. His eyes burned like supernova suns. He exploded in a shower of sparks, and Raymond fell over on his side, his mind suddenly clear and light. Sleep fell upon him in a wave, and he rode it out to the sea. Epilogue. Once every month, Raymond, Todd, Jack, Mrs. Tinley, Margaret, and her son met in the attic of Margaret's house to gather on the floor and pray as a group. They thought it was only right, because it was important for them to remember the day the earth almost ended, while everyone else had forgotten. It was as if the day had never happened, even though the memory of it was still fresh in their minds. The 6 of them had been the only ones to experience the apocalypse. The next morning they woke up in their beds with their families, with their wives, husbands, and their children. The town hadn't been destroyed and was still in one piece. The dead were not walking the streets, and a bottomless pit was yet to be formed at the center of town, and they were the only ones who had memory of that horrible day, and their final altercation with the demon in the attic. They were all blessed with nightmares, though they still had a place in reality. Each of them could recall with expert clarity what happened that day, up until the Christ figure appeared before them in a cast of light. Raymond had to tell them the rest of the story, where the being had shown its true form. Apparently Raymond had defeated the creature in that last minute, resetting the doomsday clock back to 0. But was it still counting? Though they wanted to believe they had shared the same dream for some inexplicable reason, they still held an enormous responsibility for the safety of their loved ones and the town. Perhaps they had seen into the future somehow, at the inevitable scene to come, and they could prevent it. Or perhaps they had been the participants in a cruel virtual reality created by the demon for its own enjoyment. What remained certain was the realization they carried with them every night they went to sleep, kissing their partners goodnight as if for the last time. It was the realization that they shouldn't jump to trust anyone, just because he can appear before them in a shaft of white light. Every night Raymond prayed to meet the demon again in his dreams, just so he could refuse him one more time, and discard him into the darkest pit of his own unconscious. Raymond had braved the apocalypse and survived. Although he hadn't quite made it to midnight, he wondered what happened after that. He wondered what it would be like to step off the cliff into a bottomless pit and fall forever. Even though the fantasy gave him a dark thrill in his stomach, it was better he didn't find out.
I dream in black and light. Randall, middle-aged, sits Indian-style on a dark stage with only his person illuminated in light. He is speaking into a tape recorder. Randall: I can only hope this is my last recording. It feels like I've gone through 1,000 of these tapes and I haven't listened to a single one. I guess I'm not doing this for reference. I have to get these ideas out of my head into spoken words, because that makes them real. This way they can permeate out into the universe, to be plucked up by anyone or everyone. I just like to know that I'm not crazy. If I didn't have this tape recorder, I'd just be a madman talking to myself. But if anyone is listening, I'd like to restate my assumptions here. I'm Randall, and my life is a dream. Everything about it, the car, the home, the wife, the mom and dad, none of them exist. Not really. I first realized this when all my nocturnal dreams turned lucid. I knew I was dreaming, and I could wake up on cue. Then I stopped sleeping altogether. I haven't slept in weeks, and I'm not the least bit tired. Then I started listening to the people around me. I could predict what they were going to say before they said it. I even made my neighbor disappear into a cloud of smoke. After that, I moved on to my surroundings, those little tricks of the eyes, those shadows in my peripheral. I could carry those over to my center of focus and create living projections, like people or objects. Flying through the air and stopping time was child's play. I could build a palace on the moon if I wanted. But the night I had my first real lucid dream, I was lying in bed with my eyes closed, listening to the humdrum of the waves breaking on the close cliffs of my eardrums, like the inside of a seashell. The darkness was everything but. Colors swam in the void, giving life to a pulsing sphere of energy in the center of all this chaos. Pulling endlessly to consume all form, all consciousness, so like an eye, I thought to myself, so like my eye. And I was gone. Dreams are a difficult phenomenon to define. Being a writer, I sought for a new way to comprehend my dream, to see it in a new light, but that is often near impossibility. Dreams are completely devoid of reason, which is the main faculty I utilize during the day. Yet when I go to sleep, reason is shed like a coat off my shoulders, and I am pure willpower. Anything and everything's mine. In my dream, I thought aloud. I spoke to my bedroom, in a booming voice that echoed inside my head. The words didn't seem to come out of my mouth. They came from the floor and from the walls. In retrospect, the words weren't coming from my vocal cords. These were my thoughts, without pitch or tone. Here is what I said. I want to know what my choices are. And something was there to answer my plea. The walls of my room opened up and a man joined me, arms folded. I don't remember what he looked like, only that he was young, and he had dark hair. The clothes he wore were very ordinary, much like mine. He might have been dressed in a suit, but I can't say for sure. He told me that he was going to help me without even speaking. My dreams spoke for him and took the reins for a short second. He told me that he was going to show me where I could go after I die. He knew some animals that I might consider as possible candidates. This man was my guide. He wasn't anyone I knew. Though it is random and confusing, I know what happens. Dreams are solely based on what is familiar to us. They aren't obsessed with carrying on a string of events to tell us a story we may find entertaining. Dreams are like inkblot tests of our sleep. When you glance at an inkblot, you must blurt out the first thing that comes to mind. An angel, that's a spider, a lamp. When we first begin to slip into deep sleep, our mind is a blank canvas. To start off a dream, our subconscious flicks its paintbrush and presents us a blot. Our mind then takes that splotch of paint and finds somewhere familiar to take us, and it builds from there. So for this dream, something inside me thought that the blot looked like walls, rooms, bedroom. Just like that, the setting becomes my bedroom, but what is the hook? We have an establishing shot, but where are the people? Why should we care? Everything that I associate with my bedroom, my memories and emotions, are shuffled into the back of my mind, ready candidates for what is about to take place. Invisible fingers begin to sort through all those countless numbers of cards, and they choose one. Whether the choice is random or planned, I cannot say for sure. In this dream, I don't know what card was drawn. I suppose that I meditate a lot inside my bedroom. I view it as a sort of refuge where I can collect my thoughts in peace. Here, the death card was chosen. My guide pulled me into a gray void. Suddenly I was standing on the bed of a river. There was a waterfall somewhere upstream. I couldn't see it, but I could certainly hear it. The roar was overpowering. There were buffaloes knee-deep in the river, drinking casually, their beards dripping water. It was a family. They didn't even care that they were assembling so close to a waterfall break. Any one of them could easily topple over to their deaths, but they were not afraid. Yes, this is it, I told my guide. He nodded to me and motioned for me to join them. Before I could even step 1 foot into the water, a lion pulled one of the buffaloes down in a cruel splash. It was all bleeding and hair, thrashing limbs and teeth. I couldn't look at it anymore. My guide sensed my aggravation and the scene suddenly changed. With one blink of my eye, I was in a completely different world. Now we were standing on a crop of boulders. Below us, a lion was prowling under a line of trees on its haunches. I smiled at this and shook my guide's hand. I wanted to go meet the lion, but a part of me knew everything there was to know about it. A second ago, I had hated it for killing the buffalo, but now I understood. The buffalo was the meat, the lion was the hunter, and I was fine with that. That's me, I said. Nothing hunts me. My guide frowned, and I watched the lion closely. I could tell that it was starving. It had spent the last week searching for food, and the little game that it had found had gotten away. It was dying. I could not grasp this. Never before had I seen the hunter lose. The hunted was always the first one to go. How could this be? The lion lay down in the grass and did not get up.
I shook my head and the guide looked at me questionably. Where would I like to go now? Somewhere protected, isolated. Now I was standing in snow, the terrible wind hardening my flesh. There was a small animal pen set out before me. There were goats in this cage, drinking and eating from troughs. I sensed that there was a farm nearby and these animals were being looked after. There was a barbed wire fence that circled them from all sides, and there were collars around their necks. Now this was the life, I thought to myself. These animals were separate from the rules governing the wilderness, inside their own little community. This place, in the middle of Arctic nowhere, was the most comfortable place I had been so far. Then I was aware of an opposing danger. I watched as the goats stood upright, their long necks reaching. It came out of the white storm. It was white just like everything else. It was an upright creation, gaunt and rubbery. Its hands ended in metallic blades, 3 for each wrist. This thing came at the pen with a snarl, and sliced through the fence with its scissor-like appendages. I watched as it cornered the goats inside their safe haven and tore them apart. I was no longer aware of the white backdrop. Everything was red. Suddenly I sprang into action, and I had all the strength of Superman. I was determination, pure confidence and willpower. Knowing precisely that this was a dream, and that I could do anything, I defeated the creature, throwing it into the snow like a bundle of blankets. I turned to my guide and he was expressionless. I nodded to him. I wasn't happy, but I accepted it all the same. Then I woke up, and I wrote it all down. This was the first dream to ever provoke that unmistakable feeling of being used. After I woke up, I felt like I had absolutely no control. I felt like I had lost my place on the planet, and more specifically, I had lost my place in nature. If I couldn't feel comfortable anywhere, where did I belong? I've come to realize that we are all out of place with nature, because nature does not care about us, and it does not give any creature any special treatment. Just because a buffalo can survive off grass does not mean it won't be killed for another lion's meal. And just because a lion can hunt down other animals for survival does not mean it is privileged with an effortless existence. In fact, there is a great chance that the lion will fail on many of its attempts for food and will starve. And even if man is to alter nature and cage his animals within his guard, nature has the ability to evolve. Like with the blade creature, and it has the ability to find its prey. The caged meal is an easy meal. Nothing is safe anywhere, not really. Nature controls us and governs us. It uses and pushes, but it never stops to pick us up and dust us off. It wouldn't even have the common courtesy to give God the floor when he speaks, or offer him a seat when he enters a room. Maybe, in a sense, I am the only privileged creature on this planet, because unlike the buffaloes, the lions, the goats, and the monsters, I am aware of how very small I am. Or maybe that makes me incredibly disadvantaged, to know that I am nothing, while still seeding for a purpose. I'm talking in circles again, but that is the curse of the writer, the thinker, the artist. To start at something beautiful will certainly bring you back to the ugly starting ground. And maybe you'll even end up with a little more material than what you started with. That's when you know you're onto something good. I've always been fascinated with the vague, unspecified images that project inside our minds like so many random slides in a show. The more I look into the complicated nature of sleep, the more these questions claw at me. Do these dreams have any significance? Are they only a composition of random thoughts and memories from the day, or are they something more? Are they windows into our souls, or into the very future? I awoke that morning from the dream and I recalled everything, every detail. The recollection flashed incomplete and out of order, but they were there, and they told a story. Usually my dreams include people I know, or they place focus on alien bodies. Other times the men and women I meet in my sleep will be composites of people I have met before. They could be someone in one moment and then be completely different the next. Sometimes that annoys me because as a man who loves to tell stories, I believe there should be something at the start to hook you, something in the middle to reel you in, and something at the end to make you nod. There has to be something at the finish line that has you saying, okay, that makes sense. Not in a dream. I could be camping with my Uncle Hector and then suddenly he morphs into my boss, and let's say he's wielding an axe, a crazed smile on his face. Then the remainder of the dream could involve me sprinting through the woods. Everything a nauseous blur. When I chance a look over my shoulder, long behold, my boss is gone and there is a bear on my trail. Though it is random and confusing, I know what happened. Dreams are solely based on what is familiar to us. They aren't obsessed with carrying on a string of events to tell us a story we might find entertaining. Dreams are like inkblot tests. There has to be someone operating the controls while I sleep. I'm certainly not there. I'm a shadow on the canvas, on the white space yet to be touched. When my eyes close, I become the darkness, ready to open up and let something surface around me. So let's say that while I'm in the shadow, there is a little man sitting behind his desk inside my subconscious. He's an artist. He's the one holding the paintbrush and controlling my thoughts. Usually I would have access to the filing cabinets piled up in the back of my mind, but while I'm sedated, it's the artist's chance to shine. So once he has the setting and has planted a few trees here and there, he must sprint to the back and go rifling through the manila envelope labeled woods. There he finds that I cherish a lot of memories among the trees, the earliest being a camping trip I shared with my uncle when I was only a boy. That seems plausible enough, and so far everything is making sense. So the artist plants my uncle and me into the scene. I am no longer a shadow. I have blended into the colors swirling in the darkness. I am part of the work. Now that I am present inside the picture, I can take over the artist's job. Now he can sit back and relax, and I have full control of the filing cabinets. I can now take this dream wherever I want to go and paint anything that pleases me. I begin to see the painting through my eyes, so it's not like I'm watching a home movie of the camping trip. The rules still seem to apply for sleep, so it's just like being awake. We are watching everything happen with our own eye. And what is more familiar to us than that? I think that is why we don't realize we are dreaming half the time. We're opening our eyes, we're looking around, and in our sleep we think, well, I must be awake. How else could I be in the woods? How else could I be seeing this? But we are still not in our rational state of mind. Yet my dream self takes a whole different perspective. Here are where the random recollections of my day invade the efficiency of my dream and jam the gears. My dream self is now yanking open the filing cabinets, trying to find a new direction in which to take this camping trip. So far there is no rising action, and there certainly isn't a climax. There are only two people sitting in the woods, looking at each other like idiots. For unknown reasons, the filing cabinet starts to rock and the files inside shuffle and reshuffle themselves. They get mixed together and the freshest memories get moved to the front. It's almost like there is a higher power involved in all of this, and it's demanding something new and different. So when my dream self goes for the envelope labeled woods, he sees that the real contents are now gone. But there isn't time to go looking for the bright memories. The dream is going on at that very moment. It is like a live show, where the producer is searching desperately for the actor's cue cards, but all he can find are the lines for the next segment. So he has no choice but to present the cards he has in hand and pray. The dream will go on with or without us, so our dream selves have to paint what they find. The freshest memory I had of that day, before my lucid dream, and before getting into bed, was work, and I was talking with my boss. He was telling me this story about a stupid argument he had with his neighbor about a borrowed axe. That is my last memory of the real world. But now I just want to wake up. But my fear is that there won't be anything to wake up to. What if this is it? What if I'm God? Why not? I'm the dreamer, aren't I? That means Coca-Cola, nuclear bombs, cell phones, and democracy were all products of my mind. Yet that's a little egotistical. Solipsistic. I think there's something much bigger channeling these ideas into my head. After all, that must be it. I have to shed my ego before I can truly wake up. That's why this repulsive light insists on blinding me. That can't be too hard. I have to see that I'm not at the center of the universe, and something far bigger exists outside me. It's weird, but I keep thinking of the Matrix. I'm on the verge of non-existence, and I'm stuck on this movie I once saw. I've tried to wrap my brain around it. I've tried to make sense. In the Matrix, bending a spoon with your mind is not in physically bending the spoon, but understanding that the spoon doesn't exist at all. Just like this tape recorder, it doesn't exist. I was talking to nobody but myself. He drops the recorder into the darkness. No, it can't be that simple. Nothing is. There's got to be something else, something listening. If not, my life would have ended a long time ago. I was never really alone. When a man believes he's alone, he expands until he fills up the entire universe, allowing room for nothing else. That was the greatest illusion. Even more so than the job or the car, I was never talking to myself. The universe is a great ear, tuning in and out of conversations. And now that I've deconstructed everything, besides me and it feels threatened. It doesn't want to be snuffed out of existence like everything else I know. That dream it sent me was a warning, and now I can hear the beast breathing in the darkness, its scissor claws clinking together as it approaches. The universe came to me in the guise of my guide, my higher power, but I'm not falling for it. I'm most concerned about its true form, that albino thing in the snow. That's what it becomes when it's cornered, and now the thing is squealing in pain, louder now. I can feel its rancid breath on my face. Tell it something interesting and wait for a response. Well, how about this? My boss actually lent out his axe to me, and he was upset because I never returned it. Why? Because I needed it for this moment now. And here it is in my hands, sharper and shinier than it ever was in reality. I am the lion, not the goat for slaughter. I'm the hunter, and because I'm the lion, I can see in the dark. I get it now. Turn the lights off. Turn the lights off, I get it. Turn them up. The lights switch off and there is the sound of metal grinding together, the grunts of a man with all of his weight directed in one forward movement, and the screech of a creature and the spill of blood. The light does not switch back on right away, but the corridors of the black, empty space are suddenly filled with the soft humming of a man, building up to the crescendo formation of a new world. Fade out.